We have a very difficult question to address here on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. It comes via email from a young woman by the name of Jane. That is not her real name. I'm trying to protect her privacy, but here is what she wrote me. She said, I would like this not to be a theological debate, but rather a human conversation where we share our experiences. I'm an atheist. And the standards I believe in are freedom to the extent of not harming others. Reasonable, right? So I'm a lesbian teenager who's madly in love with a girl. She's so kind and she has dark humor and she's a really talented violinist. I get butterflies when I'm around her. I worry if I said something weird to her. You can relate with all those feelings from when you were a teenager, right? Is there anything substantially different from you loving the opposite gender and me liking the same gender? The fact that this is seen as shameful by my family makes me really sad. My mother took all the pictures of me down from the wall when I came out to her, which made me feel really unloved. She said I was disgusting and that I should be kept a secret. Forget about what God is telling you. Look at what you're doing. For all that it matters, I could be your daughter. Would you say all that to your daughter? You are hurting people. If you don't mind, can you share a time when you felt unwelcome or judged? Have you ever met a gay person, gotten to know them? We're people too. Thank you and have a good day, Jane. Thank you so much for writing, Jane. By the way, if you want to submit a question, it's hello@crossexamined.org. We get a lot of them. I'm sorry I can't respond to all of them, but I do want to respond to Jane. Again, not her real name. I'm very happy that you wrote in, Jane. And let me say that what I'm going to say here is emotionally difficult. It's not intellectually difficult. In other words, I think if we're honest with ourselves and honest with the facts, the answer to your questions here is clear, but it's difficult to accept emotionally. I get that. So what I'm going to try and do is respond by asking a number of questions and making some comments, answering what you wrote here. But before I do, I want to recommend a couple of books for you, Jane, because even if I spend the whole podcast, this whole radio program here on the American Family Radio Network on this question or on what you wrote me, it's still not enough. We're talking about, as I say, an issue that I think is emotionally difficult, but I don't think it's intellectually difficult. But there's so much more to say than I can say. So I sent this to my friend, Sam Albury, who is a same-sex attracted man, but he's a Christian and he's living a celibate life. And here's what he said. He said, I'd recommend Rachel Gilson's book, Born Again This Way. That's the name of the book, which is her story of being a lesbian atheist at Yale and coming to faith. Beautifully written and a wonderfully clear apologetic for biblical marriage. So I'd highly recommend that book. Also, Sam said, I think it's important to stress to Jane how much she matters as someone made in the image of God and how Christ moves toward us in our spiritual need, not away from us. And let me second that. You're made in the image of God, Jane, regardless of any feelings you have. Everyone's made in the image of God because God has made us, and you have worth because you're made in his image, regardless of any feelings you have or even behaviors you engage in. So that's something we'll talk more about in a minute. The other book I want to recommend is a book by Rosaria Butterfield, who was a lesbian activist for many years as well. And her book is called 5 Lies of an Anti-Christian Age. 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. I'd recommend those two books. I also have a book that I'm going to email you, a PDF of the book. It's called Correct, Not Politically Correct. It's about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. And by the way, that book, Jane, is not a book that is quoting Bible verses at you. This is a natural law, medical, common sense case why same-sex marriage and transgenderism are not good for individuals and they're not good for society. So with those 3 books in mind, and of course there are others we could recommend, certainly the Bible is a book to look at, but these books, the first 2 I mentioned, Born This Way or Born Again This Way and 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age, will of course get into the biblical arguments for natural marriage and against same-sex marriage and same-sex behavior. But let me try and address now your questions directly, and I'll just go through what you wrote. And I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, Jane, and I want you to consider these questions deeply, if you would. As again, we're not going to have enough time to go through and unpack all of them, but I think they're important questions. So you write this: I would like this not to be a theological debate, but rather a human conversation where we share our experiences. Let me say that every position on ethics, every position on morality involves theology. Theology is what we believe about God and ultimate reality. In fact, the queen of all sciences is theology, because theology helps you understand how all of God's truth, if God does indeed exist, and I think he does, that's what we argue, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, all of God's truth, whether it's from biology, psychology, physics, sociology, psychology, any kind of academic discipline you can think of, how all of those academic disciplines fit under one umbrella of truth. So every conversation, especially when it comes to right and wrong, morality, will involve some sort of theological position, some sort of theological assumption. And why do I say that? You say you're an atheist and you have these standards. You say, I believe in freedom and the extent of not harming others. You say, is that reasonable? Right. Well, it may be reasonable to come to those conclusions, but reason alone can't justify why something is right or wrong. Reason can help you discover whether something is right or wrong, but it can't help you justify whether something is right or wrong alone. You'd need something beyond reason. You would need an objective moral standard that you can reason to, but that objective moral standard would not exist unless God existed. Because God is what we mean. Whatever we mean by God, what we mean is that God is the standard of righteousness, the standard of justice, the standard of love. He is the standard that we measure right and wrong by. And if there is no God, then there is nothing ultimately right or wrong. There's nothing right or wrong with either loving people who identify as gay or hating people who identify as gay, because there's no standard if there is no God. And you write that your standard of not harming others, let me ask this question with regard to that. Why not harm others to get what you want if you can get away with it? Why not? Because a lot of people have done that, quite obviously. There are criminals that get away with it. They go to their death, never paying for their crimes. There have been dictators throughout history. For example, Joseph Stalin, who started as a seminary student but rejected God and killed millions of his own people and died at the age of 74 on his deathbed, shaking his fist at God one last time. He got away with harming others to get what he wanted. Why is he wrong if there is no God? If you say, well, it's wrong to hurt people, you're presupposing a standard. Why is it wrong to hurt people? Who said? And what does harm mean? When you say you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm other people, what does harm mean? Is harm just physical? What about emotional harm? What about psychological harm? What about moral harm? What about spiritual harm? Is it right for you to harm your mom by pursuing behavior that she thinks will harm you? That's a question that we need to answer, and we're going to unpack it further right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on the American Family Radio Network, 180 plus stations around the country. This is also a podcast for those of you listening on AFR. It's the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. So if you missed something, you want to listen to it again, look for the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. You want to recommend it to somebody else. I'm Frank Turek. We're back in just 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we're having a great time going through a new series called The Bible You Never Knew, Stories Stitched by the Hand of God. We've done 2 lessons already. We do them on select Monday nights here in Charlotte, North Carolina, just north of Charlotte at Freedom House Church in Cornelius. It's up at Lake Norman for those of you in the Charlotte area. We're going to do one this Monday. We just did one last Monday. And we were talking about Joseph and how his life parallels the life of Jesus, except it does so 1,900 years in advance. Anyway, you can see these sessions on our YouTube channel, but they're not going to be up there very long. So if you want to see the first 2 lessons, you better tune in this week, because next week they're not going to be up there anymore. The 3rd lesson will be this Monday night, the 17th of February, at the 7:30 p.m. Eastern on our YouTube channel and other social media sites. So check it out. Join us there online, or if you're in the Charlotte area, you can come up to Freedom House Church. Love to see you there. Also want to mention next Thursday, Lord willing, we will be at William and Mary University in Williamsburg, Virginia. That'll be at 7 p.m. on the East Coast. If you're anywhere near Williamsburg, would love to see you. It's open to everybody, and it's also going to be live streamed as well. Look forward to seeing you all there. All right, let's go back to Jane's question. We were talking about her standard where she said, I think you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt other people, harm other people. And I was asking the question, what does that even mean? How do you know, by the way, whether you're going to harm someone or not in the future by something you do now? And harm is not just physical. It's also emotional, it's psychological, it's moral, and spiritual. And my question was, is it right for you to harm your mom by pursuing behavior that she thinks will harm you? So you see, this standard, while it generally might have some wisdom to it, when you start to unpack it, it's very hard to know whether you are harming somebody. And that's why God gives us certain standards or certain commands to not do a certain thing or to do a certain thing, because we're not omniscient. We can't see into the future. We can't see where this is going. And by the way, if God exists, some of the more severe harm you could bring upon somebody is moral or spiritual. I mean, if you engage in a behavior that takes you further away from Jesus, if Jesus is in fact the Savior, and he is, then that is the most profound harm that you could inflict on yourself or somebody else. And a little bit later here, I'm going to point out that I think certain relationships pull you away from your ultimate goal. If Christianity is true, your ultimate goal is to know God through Jesus and to make him known. That's the purpose of life, to know God and to make him known. That's why we're here. And if we engage in certain behaviors that take us away from that overall purpose, that has eternal consequences. There can't be a more severe harm than that. So, how do you know that what you do today will not harm someone in the future? You don't. So it's an impractical standard for all decisions that you make, or for most. There may be some, you don't punch somebody in the face. You can see the harm right there. We get that. But there are other things you can do that have a ripple effect to them, and you don't know where they're going. Also, I might ask, why are people inherently valuable so we shouldn't harm them? Who said? Because whenever somebody comes with a standard, I'm going to ask, where are you getting that standard from? And as an atheist, there is no way to justify why you ought not harm somebody, because you have no standard. There's no such thing as a moral obligation. Who are you obligated to? I mean, what is the moral standard that transcends human opinion, that obligates human beings to act in a certain way? If there is no God, there are no standards, objective standards, and we're not obligated to act in one way or the other. Also, as I've just brought up, what is the purpose of life? If there is no purpose, there is no right or wrong way to live life. These are all questions you need to consider, Jane, when you're answering or considering the path that you want to take. In fact, let me point out that if God exists, your mom is correct in her position. I'm not saying that everything she's doing is wise. Let me go back to what you said she said to you. She said to you, she said, I was disgusting. No, I don't agree with that. No one is disgusting. Everyone's made in the image of God. What we do might be disgusting if, in fact, there's a moral standard and we're violating it. But no, you're made in the image of God, Jane, regardless of what you do or what I do or what anyone does. We're all made in the image of God. And that I should be kept a secret. I don't know what that means. Do you mean she said you should keep it a secret, or that nobody should know that you have these same-sex desires, or you want to go down this road? I'm not exactly sure what that means there. But look, parenting is hard, Jane. Tragically, if you go down this road, you won't know how hard it is because you won't be a parent. But it's also one of the greatest things you can do. Because you're not going to be a natural parent if you stay in a lesbian relationship. And I'll unpack further why that could be a problem down the road here. But let me point out that no parent is perfect. We all make mistakes. We sometimes do things we ought not do. Sometimes we don't think them through. Sometimes we're shocked by what our kids tell us and we react rather than respond. You got to give your mom some grace. Because being a mom is hard. Being a dad is hard. Especially in this culture, when too many kids are parented by their iPhone or their Droid, or what they see on YouTube or TikTok. It's hard. You got to give your mom some grace. Maybe she didn't handle the situation like she should have handled it. And I don't know her. I don't know your relationship with her. But if she's like most moms, she cares deeply about you. And she wants what's best for you in the future. So she's trying her best to deal with a difficult situation. And yeah, could it be my daughter? What would I say if it was my daughter? I would ask a lot of questions. First of all, I would thank my daughter for telling me she's having these feelings. And I would ask questions like, when did you start feeling this way about girls? And then I would ask, do your feelings always tell you the truth? Jane, do your feelings always tell you the truth? Jane, do you ever have feelings to do wrong? Because I have feelings to do wrong almost every day. There are people that annoy me, people that frustrate me. There's people that entice me or things that entice me. And I have a feeling to do those things, to either to lash out at people or to do something I shouldn't do, either sexually or relationally. I have those feelings all the time, but that doesn't mean I ought to act on them. If there's one cultural claim that we need to reject as reasonable people, it is to follow your heart. Why? I have a whole presentation on this. I talk about it in the book. I'll send you, Jane. But following your heart is probably the worst advice you could give anybody. Why? Well, for 3 reasons, very quickly. The first reason is your heart is corrupt. My heart is corrupt. I want things I shouldn't have. I want to look out for me over every other person. I'm bent toward evil. It's easy to be bad. It's hard to be good. You don't have to teach a 2-year-old to say mine. The 2-year-old already knows it. You have to teach the 2-year-old to share. Why? Because we're selfish inherently. It's easy to be bad. It's hard to be good. So I want what I want. Of course, the scriptures talk about this, where Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful and wicked. Who can know it? Your heart will tell you you need something, that you have to have it when you really don't. I mean, Jane, if you never have a lesbian relationship, you don't need to have a lesbian relationship. You may think you do, but you're wrong. In fact, to live a fruitful life, you don't even need to have a sexual relationship. Oh, how can you say that, Frank? This is America. Yeah. Jesus had a fruitful life. Never had sex with anyone. Never thought about that. You don't have to get married to have a fruitful life. Paul even says you can devote more of your time to the Lord if you're not married. Now, obviously, if everyone did that, we wouldn't survive, but there's advantages. Look, there's advantages to all sorts of different situations. There's advantages to being married and there's advantages to being single. So the first reason you can't blindly follow your heart is that your heart is corrupt. And if you follow your heart without moral restraint, you're going to wind up in a very dark place. The second reason you can't follow your heart is because your heart is conflicting. In other words, you may have two hearts on the same issue. You know, on the one hand, you might want to be in shape. You might want to work out. On the other hand, you might love glazed donuts. You can't follow both hearts. If you do, you're not going to achieve your goal. You might even like this girl, as you said, and you might like this girl romantically. On the other hand, you might see somebody else you like romantically. You can't follow both hearts. You got to make a choice one way or the other. In fact, when I got married, it put a big damper on my dating life. I couldn't just pursue anybody I wanted to pursue anymore. And that's, by the way, what love does. Love binds itself to the loved one. Love doesn't allow intrusion on the relationship from other parties when we're talking about a marriage, when we're talking about romantic love. Love, by definition, forsakes all others to take care of the loved one. So your heart is conflicting. You can't follow both hearts. You might have 3, 4 hearts on a particular issue. And if you blindly follow your heart, you're going to blow up every relationship you have. I can tell you as a married man now of 39 years, if I followed my heart every time I saw someone else attractive, and men, you know this, you find women attractive everywhere you go. If you're married, you just can't follow your heart and pursue those relationships. You're going to destroy your marriage. You're going to destroy your family. You're going to destroy your future. You're going to destroy your relationship with God to a certain extent. And you're going to sin against God and sin against your spouse. It's not the right thing to do. You just can't follow it. And the third reason we'll cover right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network. We're responding to a question sent in by Jane, who claims to be a lesbian teenager. We'll do more right after the break. Don't go anywhere. Back in 2 minutes. What does love mean, ladies and gentlemen? We're going to get into it as we continue through the questions sent into me by Jane, who identifies as a lesbian teenager in love with another girl. And I'm asking Jane some questions. Do your feelings always tell you the truth? Do you ever have feelings to do wrong? I do all the time. And I can't just follow my heart blindly. I just can't do that because, number one, my heart is corrupt. Number two, my heart is conflicting. And number three, my heart is changing. Your heart changes. In fact, people who struggle with gender dysphoria, especially in our culture today, there's been like a 6,000% increase in girls claiming to be boys. It's almost completely social media driven. This is called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Jane, I cover this in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. This book right here, if you're watching on YouTube. And 80% of those young people grow out of their gender dysphoria by the time they're age 18, and 96% grow out by the time they're 26. Grow out of it by the time they're 26. In other words, they revert back to their biological sex. They no longer have gender dysphoria. It would make very little sense to try and mutilate a child when the problem is going to be solved purely by the passage of time in all probability. And it wouldn't make sense to mutilate a child even if it wasn't going to be solved. Because our hearts change. And especially when you're young, Jane, your heart changes. In fact, only 7% of people who claim to be lesbians are exclusively lesbian. In other words, they never have any romantic relationship with the opposite sex, with men. because hearts change. Things change. And if you blindly follow your heart today, what happens in 5 years from now? I don't know how old you are, Jane, but I'll assume you're 16. What happens when you're 5 years from now, you're 21 and your feelings have changed and you would like to settle down with a man and have a family? What then? What are you going to do? Because feelings change quite frequently. In fact, same-sex orientation often changes. There are many people who no longer have same-sex attraction. And of course, many in the so-called gay community, they don't want to acknowledge that, but it's true. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes it doesn't change, but sometimes it does. And so for those three reasons and other reasons, the Bible says, above all else, guard your heart because everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart. Do not follow your heart blindly without moral restraint. Now, might there be occasions where God puts something on your heart that's right and true and congruent with what he wants you to do? Sure, you can follow your heart then. Psalm 37 says he'll give you the desires of your heart, but it's got to line up with God's will. You just can't blindly follow it. You've got to restrain yourself if it's taking you down the wrong road. C.S. Lewis famously said, for any kind of success in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. You can't just blindly follow impulses, desires, or whims, even if they're persistent. In fact, all of us have something wrong with our nature that prevents us from living a perfect life, as Jesus put it in the Sermon on the Mount. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. We can't do it. That's why we need a Savior. Also, I might ask, Jane, do you think lesbian feelings are an identity? And if so, would you consider pedophilia an identity? Frank, that's morally wrong. No. Well, what if same-sex behavior is morally wrong as well? Would you consider heterosexuality an identity? See, I don't consider any of those things as an identity. We may have feelings oriented toward any of those behaviors, but that's not who I am. That's not who you are. Biologically, we are men and women made in the image of God. And what actions, or let me put it another way, what desires we have doesn't define who we are. And our behaviors that flow from those desires are either right or wrong on their merits. They're not justified by any particular feeling we have. You see, there's a difference between attractions and actions, and we all have attractions we ought not act on. And just because you have an attraction doesn't mean the action is justified. Years ago, when I was writing the first edition of Correct, Not Politically Correct, I got an email from a guy who was undercover, formerly undercover. He wasn't anymore as an FBI agent. He was undercover with NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, the pedophiles. And you know the argument they were using to justify their position? We were born this way. This is our identity. And you may have seen, Jane, I don't know if you've noticed, but in our culture today, there are people trying to normalize pedophilia, sex with children, calling themselves minor attracted persons. They're trying to change the language to try and make what is immoral acceptable. And their justification is they have these attractions, therefore, they're just acting on their attractions. And you may have heard many in the so-called progressive Christian movement are talking about live your authentic self. No, do not live your authentic self. If I lived my authentic self, if I followed every whim and desire and feeling I had, I would be divorced, addicted, broken, alone, and probably prematurely dead, and I wouldn't be serving God. No, don't follow your authentic self. Your authentic self has a corrupt heart. Your authentic self has a conflicting heart. Your authentic self has a changing heart. In fact, why would God give us a revelation that has certain moral precepts in it if our authentic selves were pure as the wind-driven snow and we could just act any way we wanted to? Because we can't. Because when God puts a moral restraint on us, it's not for his benefit. He's infinite. You're not improving him or degrading him by obeying or disobeying him. The people or the parties that get benefit from moral restraints are us, human beings. We get the benefit of moral restraints, not God. He's not looking down on us going, gee, I don't want them to do stuff because I don't want them to have a good time. No. He wants us to flourish. He wants us to know him and become more like him, to be conformed to the image of his son. So you can't blindly follow your heart. You can't find your authentic self. And let me also ask you this. If sexual preference is an identity, what happens when you can no longer sexually perform or you're no longer sexually preferred? You no longer have an identity? No, your identity is not tied up in what you feel. Your identity isn't even tied up in necessarily what you do. Your identity is tied up in who you are as defined by your creator. In fact, let me give you an illustration of this. I may think my car is a submarine, but my feelings about the car don't define what it is. The creator of the car defines what it is. If I treat my car as if it's a submarine, I'm going to destroy the car and myself because I don't define what the car is. The creator of the car defines what the car is. And the same thing is true about human beings. We don't define what we are. Our creator defines what we are. So your identity is not in your feelings. Just like if you have a feeling for adultery or a feeling for theft or a feeling for sexual promiscuity or a feeling for sex with children or a feeling for, you could think of anything. It's not your identity. It is a thought you might have. It's a feeling you might have, but it's not who you are. Jane, you go on to say this young girl that you're attracted to, she's so kind, she has dark humor, and she's really talented violinist. These are all, okay, they're positive traits, right? You say, I get butterflies when I'm around her. I worry if I said something to her, weird to her, you can relate of all the feelings, or can you relate to all the feelings you had when you were a teenager, right? Yes. I sometimes get them now with my wife and even with people who I'm not married to. But I can't follow all those feelings because it would be wrong to act on most of them. I would destroy myself. I would destroy my relationship with my wife, my family, and God. And you go on to say, is there anything substantially different from you loving the opposite gender and me liking the same gender? Yes, actually there is, Jane. I know this might be emotionally difficult, but intellectually it's not. Let me give you 3 quick reasons why the relationships are different. One is the sanctification of the individual. And I'm going to unpack these in a minute. Secondly, is that societies turn out better when loved and brought up by their biological parents. So children are brought up better, and therefore societies are brought up better when people are loved and brought up by their biological parents. This is the biblical purpose of marriage, or let me say the societal purpose of marriage, to perpetuate and stabilize society, not to recognize romantic affinity or feelings. The reason we have marriage from a government perspective is to perpetuate and stabilize society. So let me review those. The sanctification of the individual, number one. I forgot the second one. The second one is the survival of the human race. And the third is the flourishing of civilization. It's dependent on the man-woman pairing. So let me deal with them in reverse order. And that is, the flourishing of civilization is dependent on the man-woman pairing. That's where I just mentioned that human beings turn out better. Kids turn out to be better adults, better children and better adults when they're brought up by their biological two-parent parents. That's just what the data show. Are there exceptions? Of course. I'm talking about the aggregate data. And secondly, past the survival of the human race or the flourishing of the human race is the survival of the human race. Because if we all lived in a same-sex relationship, obviously, society would, in a couple of generations, cease to exist. The human race would cease to exist. So, for survival purposes and the flourishing of children and societies, those are two big reasons why you can't equate same-sex relationships and opposite-sex relationships. And I'll talk about the sanctification of the individual right after the break. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network, back in 2. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Looking forward to seeing you guys on Monday night, the 17th, for another edition of The Bible You Never Knew. So join us at 7:30 Eastern. Also next Thursday, join us at William and Mary University in Williamsburg for another I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on campus. It'll be live streamed, plenty of Q&A. Hope to see you guys there if you're anywhere near Williamsburg. Let me go back to what we're talking about. We've got a great series of questions from Jane, a young person claiming to be a lesbian in a lesbian relationship. And I was talking about 3 reasons, and there's more than these, obviously, but 3 practical reasons why same-sex relationships and opposite-sex relationships are not the same. And I mentioned the survival of the human race, the flourishing of society, and now let's talk about the sanctification of the individual. It's not often thought this way, but this is important. The kind of relationship you're in will either make you more selfish or more selfless, and how you conduct yourself in that relationship. I don't have time to unpack this completely, but I do unpack it in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. And I'm just going to quote a couple of stats here and then talk about what it means. This is from Correct, Not Politically Correct. The average number of sexual partners in a lifetime for a heterosexual is 4, but for a homosexual, it is 50. And studies show explosive promiscuity in the heterosexual community. I don't have time to get into all of it, but the University of Chicago found monogamy among heterosexuals to be 83%, but less than 2% for homosexuals. Another survey had more moderate results, but still found infidelity in 62% of gay couples. And that led researchers in the Journal of Family Psychology to write this, quote, "The practice of sexual non-monogamy among some gay couples is one of the variables that differentiates gay and heterosexual couples," unquote. Now, why would you have this explosive promiscuity among gay couples? And it's more pronounced in men than women. Why is monogamy more common among men and women? Could it be because men and women are designed for one another and therefore complementary? Think about it. One of the least mentioned aspects of this debate about same-sex marriage is how men and women complement one another. Each sex balances and moderates the other by providing what's lacking in the other. However, in same-sex relationships, the pairing of identicals propels them to extremes, not balance. Lesbians tend to push one another to emotional extremes, as evidenced by the intense demands they often put on one another. But male homosexuals experience the most damaging effects of imbalance. Instead of the sex drive of the man being balanced by the emotional needs of the woman, male homosexuals reinforce and amplify the sex drive of one another. That's why their behavior often becomes compulsive to the point of explosive promiscuity. Anywhere from 21 to 43% of homosexual men have had several hundred partners. I go on to say in another part of the book, the pairing of identicals, particularly men, only feeds insatiable lust that leads to explosive promiscuity, but the natural balancing that takes place in a natural marriage is conducive to love, monogamy, and children. Anyone in a natural natural marriage knows that a strong marriage requires the frequent sacrifice of your own comfort and desires for the good of your spouse and children. With loving sacrifice comes growth, maturity, and contentment, unquote. And there's more in the book that I can't say on the air. Again, the book is correct, not politically correct, but the bottom line is, if Christianity is true, and it is, and if our purpose as human beings is to become more like Jesus, to become less selfish, more selfless, the one way to do that is through marriage between a man and a woman, because it's going to force you to actually give up what you want to take care of another person. Not the pairing of identicals, but the pairing of opposites. Yes, we're complementary, but that also creates challenges where I have to forego maybe my physical desire for the emotional needs of my wife, and my wife on occasion will have to do the opposite. That forces you to come out of yourself and take care of somebody else. And I say to my wife all the time, look, I'm a sanctification machine for you. If I'm difficult to live with, and I am, let's look at it positively, okay? I'm helping you to become more like Jesus if you take this the right way. Rodney Dangerfield famously said, my wife and I were happy for 20 years, and then we met. Because relationships are hard. If you put two broken people in one relationship, there's going to be difficulty. That's just the way life is. But if you pair identicals, you're going to drive selfishness. There's a strain of narcissism here because you are attracted to someone just like you, rather than someone opposite you that you have to adapt for. Now, there's more to be said on that, but I'm running out of time. You go on to say, Jane, the fact that this is seen as shameful by my family makes me really sad. Let me say this. By what standard do you think your mother is wrong? What if she's right? If God exists, she is right. If God does not exist, she is not right, but neither are you, Jane. Because there is no right or wrong unless God exists. You go on to say, my mother took all the pictures of me down from the wall when I came out to her, which made me feel really unloved. Okay, I wouldn't do this as a mom or a dad, but again, you got to give your mom grace. She's trying because she loves you. In fact, if she didn't love you, she wouldn't care what you did, Jane. In a certain sense, in one sense, the opposite of love is in hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Go ahead, do what you want, kid. I don't care. If she's mad at you, it's because she loves you. Now, I'm not saying this justifies her anger necessarily. I'm just saying this is a difficult position. And let me ask you this, Jane. We're supposed to honor our parents. If you think that your mother has to change her views to accommodate you, why do you think that is? Why shouldn't you have to change your views to accommodate your mom or to accommodate God more appropriately? Because the truth is, neither you nor I are the moral arbiters of the universe. Neither is your mom. But your mom has a responsibility for you. And if your mom is a Christian, and if God does exist, your mom is trying to steer you in the right direction. Love does not mean approval. Can you still love your mom but not approve of her stance? Sure you can. Can your mom still love you and disapprove of your stance? Sure she can. In fact, she wouldn't be loving if she didn't disapprove of what you were doing. Now, how she disapproves? Okay. Maybe she's gone overboard. Maybe she hasn't presented it correctly. But you might want to go to her and say, Mom, I want to know the truth. I want to do what's right. Can you help me? If you don't want to know the truth and you don't want to do what's right, then don't blame your mom for being frustrated. Don't blame your mom for wanting what's best for you, yet you're in rebellion. You can't forget what God is telling you. And then you ask me this, Jane, you say, if you don't mind, can you share a time when you felt unwelcomed or judged? Yes, I can tell you. At protests that some LGBTQ folks have done at our university events. Yeah, I felt unwelcomed and judged. Now, it's their right to do that. But I'm asking, by what standard do they think they are correct? And yes, I felt unwanted and judged when I got fired by LGBTQ folks from Cisco and Bank of America. Again, I tell the story in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct. Yeah, I felt unwanted and judged. Okay. So I know the feeling. And of course, growing up, yeah, there's times you're not on the in-group. I get that. But as human beings, we're supposed to follow what God wants us to do, to know him and to make him known. And there's going to be a lot of people that are going to oppose you when you do that. Yeah, it's easy to fit in to a culture that wants you to be you, your authentic self, and will applaud you all for that. But that's a dead end, Jane. Ultimately, it's not going to work out. And then you write, have you ever met a gay person, gotten to know them? We're people too. If you mean by gay someone who is same-sex attracted, of course. But if you mean by gay someone who is actually defined by an attraction, no, I don't think those people exist. Now, they may think they're defined by the attraction, but I don't think it's valid. I don't think that's who the person is. In fact, I tell the story of my next door neighbor in the book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, who identified as gay. I love that guy. That guy. He was a little bit older than me, but he was my neighbor. In fact, his younger brother was my best friend. And his parents thought they were doing the righteous thing by affirming his same-sex attraction. Well, we buried him at the age of 33, I think he was. He was dead from AIDS. This is way back 30 years ago. I tell the story in the book. I don't think the parents were well intended, but I don't think it was the right approach to affirm their son in a behavior that would ultimately destroy his life. And not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally. In fact, on this kid's deathbed, he cursed his own mother. Yeah, he was partially inflicted with dementia because, AIDS breaks down your immune system. And anyway, it was not a pretty ending. So, Jane, the key point here is commit to following the truth wherever it leads. Give your parents some grace. You've shocked them. Think about the questions we've talked about. Get those books that I mentioned at the top of the program. We'll put them in the show notes as well. And I'm going to email you a book as well. And thank you so much for writing in. I hope it's been helpful. God bless you. Follow Jesus, not the culture.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.